All right, hi guys. Like Kirk said, my name's Chloe Ashford. I'm a security consultant at Quantum Security. Before I start, thanks Kirk, and thank you all for coming along. It's really good, I think, if you're interested in security to get involved in these kinds of things. You might know some things, but you'll be surprised at what you do pick up on, so good on you guys. So first, Quantum. So Quantum is Wellington-based, like Kirk said. We're about 25 people at the moment, and the business is kind of split into two halves. One half is the kind of technical testing side, so that team does a whole lot of penetration testing, more technical testing reviews. And then there's the risk and assurance side, so that's where I sit. We do more risk assessment, risk management, controls validations, audit, and so that's what the bulk of my work is. And then me. So I never thought that I would work in IT, let alone security. I actually have an undergraduate degree in psychology and business management, and then I, through a random journey of working in recruitment, thinking I'd go into human resources. I don't know why. I liked people at the time, and yeah, that's changed. So I ended up working in IT recruitment, recruiting people into jobs within IT, and I slowly became more and more jealous of the cool projects that I got to help get them employed to do, and thought, oh, why am I not doing that? So I came back from the UK where I was living and restudied through the Auckland ICT grad school, did my master's in IT, and here I am somehow in security. And it sounds like hearing other people's stories. It's a bit like that. There's a bit of luck involved, but then there's also networking, getting to know people, meeting people in the industry, and then there's open doors. Anyway, cool, let's actually talk about things we're here to talk about. So my main goal today with this talk is just to introduce you into starting to think about the kinds of threats that might impact the applications that you develop, the systems that you support, and how you might protect against those systems. I think, oh, oopsies, if I do that, that's not good. All right. So I think threat modeling is a great place to start when you're trying to approach security in a structured way. And actually, when Kirk and Erica approached me to talk about threat modeling, I was quite nervous. So full disclosure, I don't do pure threat modeling in my day-to-day job, but it's actually part of wider risk management. So you have to think about the threats to actually understand the wider risk position of any system. Oh, I keep doing it. 1 second. I'm just going to make this smaller so I can actually see my notes. Cool. So there's kind of two parts to this talk. I want to talk about how you go about threat modeling and the practical side of that, but I want to put a little bit more context around that for businesses, because at the end of the day, security to a business is actually a risk problem. So they want to only do as much as they need to do to decrease the risk to themselves if they don't do anything. But we'll talk about that a bit later. So starting with definitions to make sure we're all on the same page. So an asset is something that we're trying to protect within our system. So this could be a computer file, it could be a piece of software, some hardware, it could be some sensitive information in our database. But if that was to be damaged or disclosed, then we might have a negative impact to our business or whoever owns that asset. Oh, yep, all right. Next, a vulnerability. So a vulnerability is a weakness or a lack of protections in trying to protect that asset. So this could be, this is something that could be exploited that would then cause harm to the asset. So this could be things like a flaw in your application code, it could be that someone's made a mistake, or it could be that we have a limitation of our technology. Next, a threat. So a threat is the thing that goes bad or something that negatively impacts the asset. So the threat is the potential occurrence that causes harm. This could be action or an inaction. It could be intentional or unintentional, and it could be occurring from a person, another company, a network, a piece of hardware, the environment, all sorts of things. And then next is risk. So risk adds the element of possibility. So it's the possibility that a threat exploits a vulnerability in order to harm an asset. For example, an IT example, the risk is that we've got some data in our database that is disclosed to a third party. This is because a hacker, the threat, is able to use an injection attack in our application in order to access our data, and that's because we aren't sanitizing our inputs, for example, which is the vulnerability. And then lastly here we've got security controls. So a security control is anything that removes or reduces a vulnerability or protects against a specific threat. So in the example we used, the control would be that we sanitize our input, we might disallow users from actually providing inputs, or whatever else we want to do to protect ourselves from that threat. All right, so I touched on this previously. So why would we, either ourselves as a developer or we as a business, want to actually identify threats to our systems? And like I said, IT security really only exists in the context of risk. So businesses are really driven by risk management to implement protections. So this could be things like non-compliance to laws or standards. Think PCI DSS. So if you're going to do make payments through your system, you need to comply with those standards in order to be allowed to do that. It could be that we lose data. So within our system, we might have financial information, we might have personally identifiable information, we might have proprietary information, and it's very likely that if we have that information disclosed or damaged, that there's going to be some impact to our business. There might be monetary cost. It could be that even just resolving an incident associated with our system costs us. It also might be that if an incident happens, we can't provide the services that we're supposed to provide. And a huge one, and I think something that people undervalue sometimes, is the reputational damage if something does go wrong. If we have 100,000 customer records disclosed to the public, then people probably won't trust us for a while, and then they'll forget. So realistically, we want to do all the things, and I really liked Kirk's model earlier because he showed you all the different things that you could possibly do, and yes, if you implement them all, then we'll be secure. But at the end of the day, your business only has so much money to put into security. So it's a balancing act. So we balance between what will it cost us if a risk is realized versus how much will it cost us for us to implement appropriate countermeasures or controls. So, yes, I'm going to move on. Lost my thought, sorry. All right, so when do we actually do this? So unfortunately, Security often is an afterthought for businesses, and it isn't until we actually have a threat that's been exploited that we go, oh yeah, we probably should have identified that and protected against that threat. And when we do it after implementation, the cost to us is actually twofold. So first, it's far more expensive to fix an issue once you've implemented your system than actually identify it and design the system to be secure in the first place. And also, if we have already implemented and not thought about security, then it's far more likely that we have vulnerabilities within our system, which means we're at more risk of things going pear-shaped. So ideally, what we'd do is consider security throughout the design and the development phases in order to reduce the vulnerabilities within our system. And as Erica pointed out when I was talking to her the other day, ideally, you'd be doing this on an ongoing basis. So you do it within your SDLC, but then you also do this on an ongoing basis, depending on whether you're changing your system or as part of your assurance, your annual assurance, or whatever your assurance plan is for your business or for yourself. Cool, so let's go through how we actually do the threat modeling. So first, we need to understand the application. So the question here is, what does the application do? The more information that you gather, the better the process will be and the more effective it will be. Next, we determine our threats, and this is the hard part. But we'll talk about ways that we can approach this, and this is where you ask the question, what could go wrong? Next, we look at addressing the threats. So what can we do to reduce the likelihood that someone can or something will go wrong, or what can we do to reduce the impact if something does go wrong, and more accurately, when something does go wrong. All right, so system analysis, that first stage. We want to understand as much as we can about the system. We want to ask all the questions, as many as we can. What does the system do? What is its primary function? Think about why the business has implemented the system and what kind of processes it actually supports. Who are the users? Do we have different kinds of users? What are they doing in the application? Do we need different user roles? Will people have different rights? More than likely they will. Where do the users actually interface with the system? Do we have a internet-facing front end that they can log in on and do whatever they do? What information is actually in the system? What are the impacts to us if the confidentiality, the integrity, or the availability of that information is breached? What technology do we use? How might that impact us? And then what kind of systems are connected? What do we send to other systems? What do we receive to from other systems? And how do we check that those inputs are valid? Like we've talked about a lot today. And one of the key tools that I always use when I'm trying to understand a system, and I emphasize this, I don't think I've ever done a job where I don't draw something, is to do a diagram. So there's loads of different approaches to this, but I feel like a data flow diagram is often quite good. Where you draw your systems, you might say, yep, this user interacts in this way, this information passes here, yeah. Cool. The fun bit and the difficult bit. So identifying threats. So when it comes to identifying threats, there isn't any right approach. I think at the end of the day, it comes down to what works for you and what you find the most effective. But a good approach that I would recommend when you're starting is to use one of the threat modeling tools that are out there, so the threat models. We're going to talk about Stride, and after talking to Ian, it sounds like some people, if you're in his class, have learnt about this, but it's pretty well known, very well known, developed by Microsoft. And it's a good place to start because it gives you these high-level categories to start thinking about the kinds of threats to your system, and then you can use those to identify real, sub-threats. So what are our actual threats? So let's talk through this. Spoofing. So spoofing is pretending that you're someone that you're not. The threat here being that if you can say that you're someone that you're not, you might be able to do things that you shouldn't be able to do, see information that you shouldn't be able to see. You get the drift. Tampering. Tampering is modifying some information or modifying something that you're not supposed to modify. So this could be data at rest, in transit, or in use, perhaps. Repudiation. So this means that you can claim that you didn't do something regardless of whether you did it or not. Information disclosure is about exposing information to someone that they shouldn't have access to. Denial of service, you should probably all heard of this. Probably, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to underestimate everyone's ability here. You all do. So denial of service is when you prevent a system from performing its function. So this could be crashing it, making it really slow, or using all of its storage. And then lastly, we've got elevation of privilege. So that's when a program or a user can do something that it shouldn't be able to do. Before we get on to an example, I want to go through some tips. And full disclosure here, I got them from a book. But I'll link that at the end. It's a good book. If you're interested, you have a look. So number one, start with external entities. So the reason we might do this is because the external entities are less predictable. We don't have as much control over them. But often I find that they're easier to understand, and it's a good place to start when you're wanting to get a few on the paper, to be honest. But also, don't forget about the internal threats. I think this has been touched on earlier, but you can do everything perfectly, but it just takes one user with elevated privileges to make a mistake, and then boom, you've had an incident. Next, don't ignore a threat because it's not what you're looking for. So I think it's very easy to fall into, I must follow Stride 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and go, well, that's a good idea for a threat, but then when you come to number 6, you've forgotten about it. So make a note, come back to it if you want to keep going in the structured way. But also, if you think, a really good threat is that, someone can connect to our database and read our information. So is that a spoofing threat, or is that an information disclosure threat? And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. The whole point here is that we're identifying threats to our system. Stride isn't a categorization tool, and it probably wouldn't be a very good one if you tried to use it as one. And then lastly, focus on feasible threats. So, it's possible that someone hires our cleaners who have access to our building to install a keylogger onto our machine, and then they can steal our passwords and get into our system. But that's not really, it's possible, but it's pretty unlikely. It's far more likely that someone hasn't patched, or someone's able to execute a vulnerability in our web server because we haven't patched it. At the end of the day, we're going to spend our time and our money on things that are more likely to happen. Cool. So let's talk through an example. And I had some great advice to talk about something you're interested in. So I spend far too much time gaming. Maybe I'd be better at my job if I spent less time gaming. Gotta relax somehow. Let's talk about Blizzard. This is a super simple representation. I'm sure that Blizzard's far more complex than this. Blizzard Entertainment's a game developer. So they make games like Overwatch, the best one ever. So you can go onto their website. You can't play games on their website, but you can go on, you can buy games, you can see your profile and update your gamer tag and whatever you want to do. So let's talk through this. So you might have your user, your gamer, who uses their web browser to go to the Blizzard website. So that connects over the internet to a web server. The web server probably talks to an application server that does all of the things it needs to do. And then it probably talks to a database. So really simple here. And what I usually do when I'm drawing my diagrams that I always draw whenever I'm looking at a system is when I'm thinking about the kinds of threats that might be in there, is I visually represent them on the diagram. So we're going to do this. It's pretty crude for this one, but we'll do it. So let's think about Stride. Spoofing. So good example of spoofing here is probably a man-in-the-middle attack, person in the middle. I saw that earlier with Alex's. It's person in the middle attack. So someone might be able to intercept our session information as it's going to the web server, and then hijack our session in order to pose as us. So the risk here is that someone might be able to perform actions on behalf of another user without actually being the user. So let's put that there. I told you it was crude, so here-ish. Right, tampering. Good examples, and we've talked about this a lot. Good example here is that maybe we can query the data in our database and we can change that information. Maybe we don't want to pay for a game. I wonder if that's possible. You can just go, oh yeah, add Overwatch to game library. So if it's possible to do that, then sure, that's another threat. For repudiation, we've also talked about this. So say we have a security incident that occurs, we need to be able to actually work out what happened and who did the thing. In this example, it might be that we don't have sufficient logging. We're not logging all of the actions and all of the events that we need to be able to actually investigate an incident. Put that there. Denial of service. So is it... I missed one. Information disclosure. All right, sorry, that would have been awkward. So let's say a legitimate user goes to view their friend's profile and all of their personal information can be viewed. I mean, it's pretty basic, but there's an example there. Denial of service. Maybe someone's really angry that Blizzard isn't going to bring out Diablo 4, and they want to be annoying. Maybe they want to do a denial of service attack on their website, on their web server. So that could be another threat to us. And then lastly, elevation of privilege. So perhaps there's a flaw that allows us to do things that we shouldn't be able to do. I mean, I don't really have a good example for this, but let's just put that here. So there's a logic flow attack. So we can do something that we're not supposed to. Yeah. All right. Cool. So we've come up with all these cool threats. Like I said, this is a pretty basic example, but it's how I would probably approach doing this. I'd go spoofing. I'd think about every part of our system, how we could actually do something around spoofing, how that might affect it. And then draw it up. So it's so good to draw up what you've come up with on your diagram so that you know that you've thought about each part. I always, when I'm doing a risk assessment, I always draw everything up and where it would sit, where your attack vectors might be. I'm using a lot of arm movement, sorry. And then when you've got your blank space over here, you go, oh, have we not looked at this? Is there something that might affect this bit? So I think it's a good way to do it. Cool, and we could stop here in terms of threats. We'll talk about how we mitigate them soon. But I just wanted to touch on how you might translate that to risk. So I think part of the reason that I don't do threat modeling in a neat little box as part of my job is because like I said, a business only really cares about risk. So where we go and where I would go with this is then translate that to risk, and that's by putting likelihood on it and making sure that we have a lot of context onto the actual implications for the business. So we kind of wrap these threats, and often it's not, we don't come up with 30 threats and then translate those to 30 risks. It's kind of, you condense that into what the business might care about, and it might be your top 12 risks, and here are your mitigations for those. So our last step in threat modeling is addressing threats. So there are a few ways that we can do this. First is to mitigate it, and this should be your go-to approach. You'll find that once you start mitigating threats, or threats and risk, that you'll be able to implement one control, and that'll sit across multiple different things. The main point of mitigating, or the main approach here, is that you're trying to make it harder for someone to exploit the vulnerability. For example, passwords. It's a really, really basic example as well. But maybe in our last example, it could be that we sanitize our inputs, or we limit our requests to the web server. Next, we might eliminate the threat. So this is almost always done by removing the feature or function that is impacted. For example, if we're worried that someone might be able to access our admin account through the web application, then we might use command line admin instead. We could transfer the risk. So this is when you let someone else handle it. And you might do this when you look at your business and you go, we're really good at XYZ, but we're bad at ABC. A good example here is that for payments. So often that can be tricky, and you then have to comply with PCI. But if you let a payment gateway deal with that, then you are effectively transferring the risk associated with that to someone else who is better at doing it. And then lastly, we might accept it, but we don't do that. No, we do sometimes. So when you accept it, you're acknowledging that the cost of mitigating the risk is higher than the cost to us if a risk is realized. This is generally not good practice, but you do see it happen. Realistically, businesses, like I said, only have so much money and only have so much motivation to implement controls. So oftentimes they'll just acknowledge it and they'll accept a risk. Cool. I have no idea how long that took. Oh, perfect. I hope that helps. I hope that that kind of will help you in your as you go into business or as you develop your own systems and applications, to just kind of put a little bit of threat modeling ideas. I'm going to stop talking. All right, thank you.
Take any questions?
Easy questions.
Okay, are there any easy questions?
Otherwise, you can
There's an
ask
easy
me
question
after.
over there. Could you repeat the question into the...
Was that one? So you're saying that what we would want to do is assume that our data will be accessed, so don't store the data there. Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good point. So he's saying, yeah, don't collect and store information that you don't need to use. And when you'll learn a lot more about how PCI is often approached, that's definitely an approach that people take. So they try and de-scope as much as they can. Actually, before I say that, that's usually sneaky, so they don't have to audit as many pieces. But exactly. But it's actually, I think it's a good approach, right? So you're reducing the number of places that information is being stored and processed, and so yeah, you're reducing the risk of the attack surface, right? Yeah. I didn't answer that, but let's talk about it after.
Yeah, cool. Thank you very much, Chloe. Let's thank her again.